It's the week ending Saturday, the 22nd of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen deadly shootings in the German city of Hanau, the shock suicide of television presenter Caroline Flack at the age of 40, and Storm Dennis hitting the UK. Incidentally, not to be confused with Dennis Publishing. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Arion McNicoll and the boss man Holden Frith. And from our sister site, theweek.com, it's Jessica Hullinger. Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Will counter-terror police of the future come in swarms?
These locusts are pretty sturdy. So you can actually implant the electrodes, put them back together. Within a few minutes, they are back to work, walking, jumping, and they can fly. Within a few hundred milliseconds, these locusts can identify a freshly introduced chemical signal in the environment. So they can smell grass, they can smell it independent of humidities. They can smell the same thing in winter or in a summer, the windy day or as a no windy day. So all these kinds of things are humongous engineering challenges.
Scientist Barani Rahman speaking on the HEC Science and Technology YouTube channel. So, Holden, you have previously wowed us with locust facts. Now you're back with more.
Yes, well, I thought
insect facts.
They went down very well last time. We are talking about a slightly different species of locust this time. A few weeks ago, it was the desert locust, which is still wreaking havoc in East Africa. This is the American locust or grasshopper. The same terms are used interchangeably. They're very closely related, but they are a separate species.
Come back, news junkies. There is a headline here.
There is. We're creeping towards it. What happened this week is that the man we heard from in the clip has published a paper in which he describes how he has bioengineered these locusts to turn them into effectively bomb-sniffing cyborgs.
Who paid for that research?
I don't know, but there is.
Did he just go rogue? I mean, that seems...
No, he's been working on it for a few years. So the clip we heard was sort of midway through this research. He's now published the results, and the experiment has been a success. And he says that this really could be a breakthrough in security practices, because the grasshoppers are very effective at detecting these smells. They can be trained very quickly, and they can actually work in a much wider variety of situations than bomb-sniffing dogs.
Can someone just, as if to a child, just briefly explain the science behind this, please?
My understanding is we're not actually controlling their brains or anything. The implants that have been put onto these creatures can detect signals in their brains, so that when the insects smell specific chemicals that are related to explosives, their brains react differently. And so we use electronics to interpret those signals, and therefore we can read these electrodes and essentially read the minds of these grasshoppers, and then that will tell us when they're close to explosives.
And that's why, Arion, I'm looking at this picture on the New Scientist website of a grasshopper wearing what appears to be a mini backpack.
That's right.
So that's feeding the signal back from its brain.
Yeah, so they've got a little backpack sitting on their back, unsurprisingly, and then they've got an electrode that goes into their head. Now, unfortunately for the grasshopper, mostly after doing this job of sniffing out explosives, they become quite sleepy and then they die. And I think that's the thing that people feel is maybe questionable about this.
That's what makes them different
experiment.
to sniffer dogs.
Yes.
Sniffer dogs don't die when they smell drugs.
No, but they do get progressively worse at it. So a sniffer dog that has just completed training is about 90% effective at identifying explosives. But the effect of that training wears off over time. They sort of lose the skill, they become more easily distracted, and they're actually least effective in areas where they're more likely to get distracted, such as airports or crowded spaces. Whereas the hypothesis from Barani Rahman is that grasshoppers will be less distracted by these situations.
I feel like we're learning lots of great things here. We're learning that grasshoppers have an intense sense of smell. Who knew? We're learning that you can train them. We're learning that there's some mad rogue science going on. And I'm learning about grasshopper backpacks. All good. But what are the implications really for the world as we know it here?
There are a lot of caveats at the moment because this is early research. There are problems foremost amongst them perhaps that the process for fitting these electrodes actually immobilizes the grasshopper. So during these experiments, they had to be fitted to motorized platforms and then driven around manually. So that's clearly a problem that would have to be overcome. But
although I guess like if you send in some sort of IED spotting device,
yes, so
you're using something on wheels anyway.
And that's exactly the sort of circumstance where this could be really useful, especially if they were still able to fly themselves. Because if you suspected that there was explosives somewhere and there was some sort of tripwire or trigger that you wanted to avoid, then something very light or that is airborne would be ideal. But also if there had already been an explosion and you wanted to check whether there were secondary devices, that's the kind of the ideal place where you could send in a swarm of locusts effectively, and they would tell you by remote control whether there were any explosive traces still in the area.
Is it fair game, all this stuff?
I think that, well, it depends where you sit on the question of animals used in all sorts of experimentation. And I think one of the problems with this is that not only does the creature tend to die at the end of it, at least in these early experiments, but also you could imagine that it's probably not going to be without suffering when the insect first of all has its brain hacked and then it's pasted to a sort of a motorized wheelchair type of thing. So there's two stages at which you could imagine animal suffering, and we've known since about 2003, according to scientific experiments, that insects feel pain as much as other creatures feel pain. So I think that look, it's fair game if you think that it's okay to sacrifice insect lives for human lives, but if you don't, then we're in problematic territory.
But apart from extreme sort of vegans, basically, as we've discussed on the show before, most people presented with a situation where, for example, someone thinks there's a bomb on a London Underground train would be happy with the idea that a grasshopper is flown in to detect whether it's there or not, wouldn't they?
Yeah, definitely. I think the public opinion is on the side of testing on animals and using animals to help, and insects presumably, to help save human lives. I think it's also worth noting that animal testing has been used for years and is accredited with saving millions of lives through, invention of penicillin, treating HIV/AIDS, blood transfusions, polio vaccine. I mean, all of this is hinged upon the fact that they were tested on animals to begin with. So, I mean, yeah, I do think this raises lots of questions. I think the curious thing is should we be hacking the minds of these creatures? I think that's what makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, because I suppose with pigs sniffing out truffles, for example, that's something that's been going on for centuries, isn't it? But if scientists then biohacked a pig so that the live signal could be sent back to HQ at Waitrose, people might feel uncomfortable about that because there is no human life at risk in that scenario.
Yeah, and I think the animal in question does matter as well. So even if human life was at stake, say in the case of a bomb-sniffing dog, I think there would be much more discomfort about opening up a dog's brain and sticking electrodes in there, even if they made it more effective or less easily fatigued in those situations.
I think there's also a question about the particular quality of the grasshopper that this scientist seems to be suggesting is distinct from things that could be detected in other ways. I don't know, but the presupposition seems to be that you need a grasshopper to do a job that, say, some sort of robot or other kind of digital sensor could not do, and that seems strange to me. Surely, if bombs are found to have certain odors, then couldn't we find a solution that is robotics-based rather than biological?
Well, he had actually been attempting to do just that before he started work with the grasshoppers. He'd been working on sort of mechanical digital sensors, and they're just nowhere near advanced enough at the moment. The fact that a grasshopper has 50,000 sensors within its antennal lobe means that it can just detect those trace elements far more effectively than any technology we have at the moment.
I mean, it's fascinating as well for kind of individual freedoms and liberties as well, isn't it? Because again, with the example of bombs, it's quite easy to sympathise with the idea that human lives would be saved if you hack a grasshopper's olfactory senses. But if the grasshopper is being trained to sniff out cannabis on a residential street, for example, then immediately people will feel uncomfortable about that, even if they know they're breaking the law in their own home.
Yeah, totally. I think it totally depends what these creatures are doing, what the animals are doing. I think you have to weigh that up with the costs. for example, cosmetic testing. People feel really bad about this. They don't want this to be done on animals because it seems frivolous, right? It's not really saving any human lives, so people object to it. So yeah, I think that definitely plays in here.
Where do you see this technology actually evolving, Holden? Is this just one of those sensational headlines, or is this science that's really going to impact us?
I really think it could, if not in precisely the form of cyborg grasshoppers, but this idea that you can sort of harness the power of nature and fuse that with immensely powerful technology and create something that's of human benefit, I think that's almost bound to happen. And it does seem that this sort of security applications and looking for ways to improve explosive detecting, that could well be one of the areas that this manifests itself in. There's been experiments with honeybees too and various other animals. So I think sooner or later we are going to see some form of cybernetic security measures at an airport near us.
Well, I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords. Jessica's up next after this. So, Jessica, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Starlight, Starbright. Oh, no, that's a satellite.
Now, one of the main drawbacks of that high altitude is high latency, or delay, in that signal that's provided because they're so far above the Earth. Starlink, on the other hand, is a constellation of multiple satellites that orbit the planet, but at much lower, at about 550 kilometers. Because of this low orbit, latency is much lower than with satellites in geostationary orbit. This enables Starlink to deliver services like seamless video calls that are usually not possible on other satellite internet systems. And because Starlink satellites fly in a global constellation, we can bring high-speed internet to places that previously had terrible service or no service at all.
A clip from the SpaceX YouTube channel about their Starlink mission. Now, Jessica, we've talked about SpaceX before in the context of basically sending wealthy tourists into space, but from the sound of that clip, this sounds like it's about bringing the internet to people via satellite.
Yeah, that's what the story is. So this week, SpaceX launched 60 satellites into orbit as part of its Starlink mission, which aims to bring low-cost, high-speed broadband to the entire world, or at least that's how they spin it. So this is their third launch this year, and it's part of a larger push by the company to essentially wrap the globe in a sort of satellite constellation, a web of satellites.
So this is a rival to Mark Zuckerberg's Internet.org thing.
Yeah, so a lot of companies want to do this. And the point being that within coming decades, there could be something like 50,000 new satellites orbiting Earth. And so this is potentially groundbreaking for our ability to access the internet all over the globe. Cool. Scientists are worried. Researchers, astronomers in particular, say this could be really difficult to manage in our field. This could potentially damage our ability to observe the planets and the stars and deep space in particular. They say that the sort of signals that are sent out from these satellites could disrupt our ability to see things that are really far away, maybe not visible, but that are giving off like radio signals and stuff. So a black hole, for example, or an oncoming object, or a dark planet, a dark star. And they warn that this could be really detrimental to the field of astronomy.
It feels a bit, Arion, like the conversations we've had before about public space becoming increasingly corporatized. Banks, for example, paying for gardens around skyscrapers, but actually they're not really public space. This is space, increasingly being owned, I guess, by corporates.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is that there's so little regulation in space, as we've spoken about on this show before. Space is still regulated mostly by the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which had 104 countries sign up to it. But subsequent efforts to get countries to sign up to increasingly stringent limitations on the way that they use space have been less successful, up until the 1979 Moon Treaty, where only 17 countries came to that particular party. So I think this is that outer space is now the Wild West. It's not just a whole lot of companies, but it's a whole lot of different countries looking to launch their own satellites into space. And so this web of up to 50,000 satellites that just Elon Musk's company is looking to launch will be matched by other webs of satellites, huge numbers of satellites that are going to block our ability to look into deep space.
So the ethics, Holden, come down, I guess, on this one to whether you value the right philanthropically of people who can't afford the internet at the moment to have access to the internet, or whether you value the right of astronomers and people with an interest in space to be able to see black holes properly. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a big part of the argument. But I think there's also a way in which you're trading off the rights of the current generation against those of the future. So the more satellites that go up into orbit, the more radio signals that they are transmitting, the harder it will become for the scientists of the future to see beyond those. And there's a group of astronomers who are particularly worried about the British company called OneWeb, which has a similar plan to put a network of internet broadcasting satellites around the world, because the particular bit of the broadcast spectrum they're using is quite close to the radio telescope spectrum as well. And there's other issues to do with the height and trajectory of their satellites, which means they're going to have much more of an impact on existing radio telescopes.
So what happens, just in the iterative nature of technology, Jess, what happens when in 10 years' time, let's say this, even if this is regulated, people think it's a good idea, it's working, and they've got a better satellite that's 10 times faster, you know, it's the 5G compared to the 2G of these ones that are going up. At that point, how do the companies that are putting this debris up there, you know, that's what it will be at that point, how do they destroy it?
Good question. So SpaceX has said that they're trying to address this problem because obviously people are raising concerns about it. And they've said that their satellites will last anywhere from between 1 and 5 years. At that point, they have a sort of like self-destruct button. I don't know if it's a button, but they will descend to Earth. 95% of them will burn up in the atmosphere, and they'll be gone. Right, sure.
Yeah, any problems
40,000. Yeah, could potentially be bad. But I think the broader question is like what this means for space junk. Like thinking about this, I had a sort of like image of like the Wall-E perspective of Earth surrounded by just like a ring of metal, and I just found that a little bit disheartening. The other concerning thing is that the more we put into orbit, the higher the risk of something going wrong. So if you have 50,000 satellites plus many millions of pieces of tiny space debris orbiting Earth, if one thing goes wrong in a sort of like gravity-esque way, it could set off a chain reaction where many of the things that we rely upon that use satellite information could go down, right? So weather prediction, GPS, a lot of things we rely on heavily. So I think it's worth questioning whether or not this is safe.
And one of the problems has been as well that Starlink has shown itself to be particularly uncompromising in its willingness to take into consideration the existence of other people's satellites. And just last year, there was an imminent collision detected between one of the Starlink satellites and a satellite owned by the European Space Agency. And the European Space Agency contacted Starlink and said, can you please change the trajectory of your flight? And they just did not respond, leaving the onus on Europe to switch the direction of its satellite. And I think this is the problem with a lot of these companies, and Starlink in particular, that they're just being inflexible in the way that they're refusing to respond to the needs of those people who are saying, for example, your satellites are very reflective. Could you paint them black and have them be less reflective? And so far, they haven't come to the party on those sort of basic requests from astronomers and others.
And I suppose their corporate responsibility could end if the company goes bust. And then it becomes the state's responsibility, doesn't it? It's going to become the responsibility of the European Space Agency and NASA.
The convention, I believe, is that the legal responsibility actually lies with the country from which the satellite was launched. That becomes fairly academic because if there was a near miss a couple of weeks ago between two satellites, one launched in 1967 and one in 1983, both long since defunct, no possibility of controlling them, changing the trajectory. And there was concerns that they were going to collide at 32,000 miles per hour, which would have sent fragments of space junk across a very wide area that would have then become a hazard to any other satellites passing through that section of orbit. At that point, I think both of those were launched from the US, but now increasingly they're launched from Kazakhstan, from China, from anywhere. But if you have a situation evolving like that, taking the Kazakh government to court, taking the American government to court, that's not really going to solve the problem.
And Jess, I mean, this kind of story titillates people who love space stuff, right? They love reading about it. They love thinking about it. They don't necessarily want to see any action happen because it's kind of sexy to them, this idea of space and lots of satellites. That's the problem that you're up against, isn't it? If you're trying to say more regulation, think about what you're doing with these satellites. That doesn't play into the hands of the people who read these stories and really get excited about space.
I actually don't know if that's the case. I think that SpaceX and many of the companies that are at the forefront of this stuff, they draw a lot of attention because they're doing really interesting, innovative things. But, I think if you love space and you are interested in what's happening there, you have to be worried about this because part of the romance of space is that you can look out into it and see something unknown and interesting and sort of magical. And if we diminish the ability for astronomers and also for just, your average Joe looking up at the stars to see something, not to be too romantic, but pure, I think you have to sort of be concerned about that and sympathetic to the astronomers. They're already seeing these satellites in their imagery. They're showing up as like bright streaks on their pictures. The more we add to the atmosphere, the more difficult it is going to be able to see into the heavens.
It does seem to be hugely symbolic of both the best and worst of human nature in that it's, if we end up with 50,000 satellites around the planet, that is undeniably impressive. It's a huge testament to our ingenuity.
Beat that, Venus.
But also, we also have an uncanny ability to destroy our surroundings and mess things up without even really thinking about the consequences.
Well, let's keep Bruce Willis and Liv Tyler on standby. Arion, you're up next after this. And finally this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
For white male video game developers, it may soon be game over.
The late game development legend Satoru Iwata is often quoted as saying, "Above all, video games are meant to just be one thing: fun for everyone." It's going to take a whole lot of change from the gaming industry and a great deal of social pressure to make it all happen. But it is my sincerest hope that sometime in the very near future, the idea that everyone can make games will not just be a truism, but will in fact be the reality for gaming as a whole.
Stephanie Orme talking at TEDx, available to stream online. Arion, what's the story?
The story is that games developers are not falling into that cliche anymore quite so much of being beardy, white guys with an interest in sci-fi films, but increasingly there are more women in games development, there are more black and ethnic minorities, and as a consequence, some people are saying games as a whole are changing as the industry itself changes.
Who's come up with these stats?
Yeah, it was the University of Sheffield, which conducted a survey of 3,200 games developers in the UK, some of their statistics were actually quite surprising. So they found that 2/3 of the UK's game development workforce is now 35 or under. Perhaps that's not so surprising.
It's not an industry that's known for employing people 50 plus.
That's perhaps the least surprising. But then 28% are women and 2% are non-binary. 10% come from BAME backgrounds. 21% identify as LGBT plus, which is particularly surprising.
That's more than the UK average, isn't it? And 2% non-binary must be more than the UK average too.
That also is. So particularly on those criteria, it's an industry that's now ahead of the curve. In terms of the representation of women, they're still underrepresented, but it's a big shift since the last big study was done in 2009 when just 11.5% of games developers were female.
But, I mean, on the women point, Jess, do you think women are underrepresented in the sense that if you look at gamers themselves and who's playing the games, I don't know, but I imagine 28% being women sounds about right. It is more men than women that play games, isn't it? Even though there are more women gamers than there used to be.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think that you're right that there are more women playing games than there used to be. I think overall, though, gaming companies are realizing that there's a business opportunity in expanding their user base from sort of the traditional, as Arion has said, geeky basement dwellers, whatever, who want to play violent video games, and actually telling different stories that appeal to a different audience. So yeah, and I think that could be part of the reason why we're seeing more people being hired into those companies. I would say that it's a business interest.
So there's a parallel story, Arion, about the different kind of games they're making away from violence, Jess says.
Yeah, there was a story in the New Statesman actually a week ago that was all about how games developers around the UK in particular are starting to shift away from violence. And they'd caught up with this senior developer, a guy called Alex Hutchinson, who may not be a household name to most people, but he's worked on some of the biggest AAA games franchises, including things like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry. And he said that he is no longer interested in games that are based on murdering. And according to the New Statesman, they then talked to a broad range of developers and found the same stories being told over and over again, that increasingly this sort of basing games on gun violence is something that developers are moving away from. We've long seen that in the sort of indie game space, where you get more interesting stories told from different perspectives and things that are about puzzles and and story arcs and characters. But I think now that's sort of progressing into the AAA sphere.
And AAA, Holden, that means basically big blockbuster hit in the gaming world. All of those, as far as I can tell, despite what Arion's just said, still involve a bloke with a gun.
They're a big portion of it, yeah. I was looking at the best-selling games in the UK last year, and apart from 2 football games, 2 racing games, you had 6 that were based on some form of combat, mostly first-person shooters, and so that I suppose there's a mirror image there with the film industry, where you have your blockbuster games and then you have a sort of more creative, artistic industry along the side. And I think we're maybe at the stage where we're beginning to see the early stages of that more artistic approach to video games. But yes, it does still seem to be at the fringes.
It's interesting too to read that the game designers themselves are tiring of manufacturing violence.
I think that's what's interesting about this moment. And there have been a lot of false dawns with people saying that here comes the age of the thoughtful game, and then, yes, year after year you continue to see the number one game be about someone with a machine gun shooting a lot of people. But I think that we're seeing not only a will from those people at the top of the industry that are creating the biggest games away from violence, but also we're seeing some genuinely big games come out that actually don't have violence at their core. And things like Portal, like a game called Monument Valley, which swept through mobile a couple of years ago, this really interesting game called Journey. You find a series of games that become big hits, not just because they're not violent, but because they're interesting games in any case. And I think that that's the shift that's going on.
I also read this interesting quote from, I think it was a developer, who said that after he became a parent, he no longer wanted to put games into the world that promoted such gory violence. And I found that really interesting, especially because one of the problems, I think, with these companies that's been highlighted is that they don't really have family-friendly policies. They require a lot of very, very hard work. They keep people late. So it becomes harder as a parent. And this is a problem broadly across a number of industries. But I think that's worth looking into. So if we want to encourage people from different backgrounds that are living different kinds of lives to come and work at these companies, I think we have to give them the ability to have parental leave, etc.
And also there's the psychological impact of working on a war game. If you spend 2 years delineating corpses, that's going to have a psychological toll.
Yeah, and reading some of the descriptions brought home what a labour-intensive process creating a game is, and it's, I think, by the sounds of it, even more so than making a film. Where if you're shooting a violent film in the cinema, you might spend a few days on that, and the sort of makeup artists will be applying the sort of fake wounds and blood. But on a video game, if a lot of it is given over to violence, then you have people who for months and months are studying real-world images of battle injuries and then attempting to recreate them pixel by pixel. And as you say, that must take a toll on you after a time.
But this isn't new in the sense there always has been Tetris. There always has been Wii Fit. I say always, but you know what I mean. The last 20 years there has been. I was an avid reader of Amiga Power when I was a kid, and I remember year after year after year, their number one game for some reason was Bubble Bobble 2, Rainbow Islands, which was a very happy, clappy sort of Mario-style arcade platformer. And there's always been both those things going on at once. Games with guns, games not with guns. Do we really see the games not with guns overtaking the games with guns? Or is it just the case they've always coexisted, but now both are bigger because people have got older, the industry's got bigger?
That's a good question. The Rami Ismail from the Dutch games developer Vlambeer, he said that part of the reason that violence came to be so baked into video games was partially because it was kind of a relic of the past when pointing and shooting was a really easy mechanic to create a game and then base it on. And as games,
because you've got a button in front of you.
Because you've got a button and you've got a cursor, and it's really easy to put those things together and turn it into a shooting game. But as games have become more complicated and the technology that underpins them has become more sophisticated, there's more opportunity to tell more complex types of stories. And also the fact that there's so much money in gaming. I mean, you're now seeing big name actors ending up in video games. They have been for a while. But there's just so much money underpinning it that I think you can afford to start doing more complex storytelling that you couldn't when Bubble Bobble 2 was the number one game for 5 years.
Jess?
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think no matter what, I think violence sells. I think that it will always sell. I'm encouraged by the diversity that we're seeing in these new games. I think that's great. But yeah, I don't think that we should be under any illusions that violent video games are going to disappear. I was encouraged by this idea that I read about, this idea that video games can actually be violent and include violent actions and plots, but can also help encourage and teach morality. So there was this game called Spec Ops: The Line, which I have never heard of, but it was about a military operation, and it actually challenged players' actions and decisions and said, posed questions to them that might help them think critically about the consequences of their actions. So I think that's a really interesting way that things could go, that we could have violent video games, but maybe go about it in a more moral way.
Yeah, I think it is surprising in some ways that games haven't developed more of a sense of either morality or just of cultural weight. Like, they still, for all of the money that gets spent on them, they still seem to be largely invisible and still talked about as if they are played by teenage boys or perhaps grown-ups who should know better. And
I mean, the amount of times in the media over the last couple of years I've seen someone have to explain what Fortnite is. You know, on the Today programme, they wouldn't just mention Fortnite, would they? They say Fortnite, which is an online game that's massively popular. And you think, you wouldn't say that about Stormzy. You wouldn't say who is a rapper who also sings a bit. Yeah. It's just, it's a huge cultural phenomenon.
And there's an assumed knowledge and an assumed interest in the Oscars or the Brits and what happens at those awards ceremonies in a way that a similar event in gaming just wouldn't attract the same sense of cultural weight. And in the same way that a good film or a good novel can encourage you to see things from a different perspective, there's no reason why a game shouldn't do that to an even greater extent, because you're actually embodying a different character and sort of having to make decisions. And I think, we might start to see more of an attempt to make more of that. There is a game coming out soon called Tell Me Why, in which the lead character are two estranged twins, one woman and one a trans man. And the sort of the story arc invites you to work out how they became estranged, what life choices they've taken, what's happened to them. And while I'm not expecting that to be displacing FIFA 21 in next year's top 10, I think that is a really interesting way of putting you literally into the mind of somebody else.
Bring back micro machines, I say. That is it. Game over for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to our players this week, Jessica Hullinger, Arion McNicoll and Holden Frith. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and be a real high scorer. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. You'll get an endorphin hit, just like Mario Kart. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.